שלום לכולם, אני מצטערת, אבל אני אדבר באנגלית ולא בעברית. רוב הדברים שאני אגיד הם קשורים לאדריכלות, ולזה חסר לי אוצר המילים בעברית, אז אני מעדיפה באנגלית. I will speak about the three large synagogues in Budapest and look at them from a perspective that has not been researched so far or hasn't been explicitly stated in research. So we will see a lot of pictures, and most of you will be very familiar with the pictures, at least those of you who have been to Budapest so far. Synagogue architecture has almost always reflected the dominant architectural language of its immediate environment. Throughout history, Jewish sacred buildings rarely developed in isolation. Instead, they adopted local forms, materials, and spatial conventions, translating them into a Jewish liturgical framework. This principle of architectural adaptation is not exceptional but normative, and it is especially pronounced in the Haskalah period and its aftermath, when Jewish communities sought visibility, stability, and civic legitimacy within the surrounding society. The adaptive process was further reinforced when most major synagogues were designed by non-Jewish architects professionally trained within Christian architectural traditions. Art historical writing has largely treated this phenomenon as self-evident, reducing parallels with church architecture to something obvious and therefore analytically insignificant. Against this background, I will examine the three largest synagogues of today's Budapest, described as the points of the Jewish triangle of Pest, not as passive reflections of their Christian surroundings, but as deliberate architectural statements in which symbolism, urban visibility, and political theological claims were actively constructed in response to both the Christian environment and internal Jewish debates. Built at first and conceived on the largest scale, the Dohány Street Synagogue establishes the architectural vocabulary against which the later synagogues of Rumbach and Kazinczy streets must be read, both in dialogue with it and in reaction to it. The first half of the 19th century saw a radical configuration of synagogue floor plans in general. In Hungary, this shift was driven by the Reform movement, which later came to be known as the Neolog movement. As Rudolf Klein has demonstrated in his typological studies of Hungarian synagogue architecture, this development produced several distinct architectural responses, one of which was by Rudolf Klein called the Catholic Church-type synagogue. The Dohány Street Synagogue constitutes the most influential realization of this type in Hungary. The Dohány Synagogue was built by the renowned Viennese architect Ludwig Förster and inaugurated for the Rosh Hashanah of 1859. Among the most immediately recognizable and most well-known features of the Dohány Synagogue in this vein of the Catholic Church are those that define its external appearance and overall spatial disposition. The facade of the building is dominated by a pair of towers with clocks in them. Above the entrance, there is a large Rosetta window, sort of not really, I don't know if it looks sharper or brighter from afar. On my PowerPoint it does, but the Rosetta window is here. So the towers and the Rosetta window reinforce the building's association with contemporary monumental church architecture. The sheer scale of the structure, unprecedented in the Hungarian synagogue context at the time of its construction, contributes to its pronounced monumentality and urban visibility. The interior spatial organization, the Rosetta window is more visible here. The internal spatial organization corresponds to this external articulation. The building is structured according to a longitudinal plan with a strong axial orientation towards the eastern wall. Within this framework, the bima is relocated from a central position to the front of the space, aligned with the Torah arc and integrated into the axial focus of the interior. The installation of an organ further aligns the interior with church architecture, albeit unlike in Christian churches where the organ is typically above the western entrance, here it is located somewhat hidden behind and above the Torah arc on the eastern wall. adapting a church-derived element to a synagogue-specific spatial hierarchy. Beyond these immediately visible features, several less conspicuous elements further define the spatial and symbolic organization of the Dohány Street Synagogue as a church-type interior. The interior is divided into 3 naves in stark contrast to medieval synagogues, reinforcing the basilical character of the space. Fixed, elevated pulpits are added, not at the front of the space, but within the nave, again following spatial conventions typical of church architecture. The pulpits are here and here. And here's a close-up of one of the pulpits. Above the main entrance, a biblical verse is inscribed. Functioning as a programmatic textual marker at the threshold of the building, in keeping with established practices of monumental sacred architecture. The text is from Sefer Shmot, and here I finally don't have to translate the text and give its context. This verse appears in other synagogues as well, and its use is always deliberate. Of particular importance is that it contains the word mikdash. The verse gestures towards a conception of sacred space that precedes the exclusive centralization of worship in Jerusalem, allowing the synagogue to be understood not merely as a place of assembly, but as a site endowed with sanctity on its own right, symbolically approaching the conceptual register of the Beit Mikdash itself. All this unfolds within the socio-political context in which Jews were not emancipated yet, and Jewish communities sought to demonstrate religious compatibility and civic loyalty to the surrounding nation. The textual and spatial framing is further reinforced by the Torah ark, designed by the Hungarian architect Friedrich Fessel. Above the ark appears a radiating sun motif with the 4-letter name of God inscribed in it, visually centering the entire composition of the ark. We'll go back to that and then jump back. So visually centering the entire composition of the ark. As Professor Bracha Yaniv has shown, this motif constitutes a recurrent feature of 19th century synagogue ornamentation. At the same time, the radiating sun belongs to a well-established symbolic language of Catholic Church architecture, where it is associated with divine presence, particularly the Trinity and the Eucharist. In Catholic Church design, sometimes it contains the 4-letter name of God. At other times, inside the sun, there are various Christian symbols. Here, this church-derived form is appropriated within a synagogue context through the inscription of the 4-letter name of God, which is then further reinforced by the biblical verse above the arch, above the ark. I couldn't get a photo where both of them are visible, but the ark is down here, so here we see basically the window above the ark. So this is the arch in the building above the ark. This is from Sefer Tehillim. This verse anchors the solar imagery in explicit biblical language and theologically recodes a form familiar from Christian iconography within a distinctly Jewish framework, linking divine praise to the movement of the sun and thus consolidates the ark as the primary theological and visual focal point of the interior. So the verse is sort of used as a proof text to legitimize the use of otherwise Christian symbolism at the ark. These architectural and design elements contributed to the Dohány Street Synagogue's controversial reception and to its rejection by more traditional circles, leading to the eventual need for the construction of an alternative, more traditional synagogue. This alternative was the Rumbach Street Synagogue, 1.5 blocks away, designed by the, again, Viennese architect Otto Wagner, his first major commission, and overseen on-site by the Austrian-Hungarian architect Mór Kalina, who was involved in several other big architectural projects in Pest at the time. The building was inaugurated 13 years after the Dohány Synagogue for the Rosh Hashanah of 1872. In contrast to Dohány, the Rumbach Synagogue deliberately distances itself from the visual language of Christian church architecture, omitting the two dominant clock towers, the rosette window above the entrance, and abandoning the organ and the longitudinal interior layout. Instead, the building adopts a Moorish stylistic vocabulary, articulated most clearly through the presence of the two minaret-like towers. There's a close-up of one of them. And an octagonal central space, and the use of a red and blue color scheme on the interior. At the same time, the Rumbach also adopts a more modest mode of urban presence. In line with earlier synagogue traditions, it returns to the actual prayer hall being concealed within an inner courtyard rather than directly being exposed to the street. The Rumbach was inaugurated after the schism of the Hungarian Jewish community, and like the Dohány, the building and the community have always belonged institutionally to the Neolog camp. So despite what people might believe, it has never, ever in its life been a status quo synagogue, but that's a different paper. But it did serve a more conservative segment within the Neolog community. This difference was apparent in the placement of the bima, which is in the center in the Rumbach synagogue, or in the fact that there was an extra mechitza on the women's balcony. Also, everyday ritual practice was different. Writing in the paper Egyenlőség in 1899, Miksa Szabolcsi observed that in Rumbach, the worshippers pray with their talit fully opened, much as among the Orthodox, I'm quoting Szabolcsi, whereas in the Dohány, the worshippers wear the prayer shawl folded and also omit certain prayers, end of quote. Despite these differences, there was no complete visual or ideological rupture. Several exterior features aligned the Rumbach visually and institutionally with Dohány and signaled their shared Neolog affiliation. Both buildings employ a red and yellow striped exterior color scheme that had become a recognizable marker of Neolog synagogue architecture in the region. And both have paired-like tower elements, albeit of different form. Internally, both included an elevated pulpit, and the current reconstruction does not have the pulpit. And I found only one photo, and it's probably not going to be very visible on the picture, but the pulpit is here. So in Rumbach as well, there was an elevated and built pulpit in the middle of basically the prayer space. And both had a choir, and cantors and rabbis wore clerical vestments in both. The third synagogue in the third synagogue of the Pest Triangle, the Kazinczy Street Synagogue, takes this logic further and already beyond the Neolog framework by aligning architectural form and ritual practice with explicitly Orthodox norms. It was built by Hungarian Jewish architects, the brothers Sándor and Béla Löffler, and inaugurated for the Rosh Hashanah of 1913. Unlike Förster's and Wagner synagogues, both conceived within a 19th century ethos of architectural innovation and representational ambition, the Löffler brothers' work reflects a different orientation. As Jewish architects operating within an explicitly Orthodox communal framework, their approach does not aim at spectacle or monumentality, but rather at a conscious realignment with earlier religious norms, reflecting the ways in which Orthodox Judaism defined itself in opposition to Neolog practice. Their building is complex and carefully composed. Its architectural language does not seek urban monumentality, even as it employs a rich and articulate former vocabulary. At the same time, the Kazinci synagogue responds directly to the two earlier synagogues of the Pest Triangle and positions itself in relation to them on an already established ideological and theological map. This positioning is legible already on the facade, whereas Dohány foregrounds symbolic proximity to the Mikdash, Kazinci articulates a different emphasis through the biblical verses inscribed above it, and again, it's very hard to take a picture that makes it visible, but you can see Manorama, Komazeh, etc. from Breshit, which frames the synagogue as a space defined by Yira, rather than by monumental representation. This phrase refers not only to an internal religious disposition, but also to the Orthodox community itself, who were known as the Yereim, as opposed to the Neologs. As a representative synagogue of the Orthodox community, the building had to conform fully to the resolutions of the Rabbinical Assembly of Michalovitz. Among other provisions, the Psak Din of Michalovitz prohibited the construction and the use of synagogues with towers, and accordingly, Orthodox communities were expected to comply, and the Kazinci synagogue complies with particular stringency. The zones where the towers might appear on both sides of the buildings are actually deliberately at a lower height than the rest of the facade, effectively producing a negative or minus tower composition. In doing so, the building positions itself in explicit contrast to the two-towered synagogues of Dohány and Rumbach. This ideological positioning is articulated no less clearly in the interior. The Kazinci synagogue abandons a longitudinal spatial organization in favor of a centralized layout. As expected, the bima is placed at the center of the prayer hall. Notably, it is positioned in the exact geometric center, in careful adherence to another one of the resolutions of the Rabbinical Assembly of Michalovitz. Also, not only is there a women's gallery and a mechitza on it, but this mechitza is particularly dense and only minimally transparent. And particularly interesting is the motive above the Torah ark, consisting of a wreath within the wreath, a Star of David, and within it, the priestly hands. There was no functional or ritual necessity for such an arrangement. The tablets of the law on the top of the ark could have sufficed as a symbolic marker. Its inclusion should therefore be understood as a deliberate response to the previously discussed motive in the Dohány Street Synagogue. The Star of David offers a broadly accepted Jewish emblem, standing in absolute contrast to the more problematic solar imagery with the Catholic associations of the Dohány Synagogue. And the gesture of the Pirkat Kohanim conveys the same divine sanctity. In this sense, the motive in the Kazinci synagogue functions as a halachically sound and theologically acceptable re-articulation of the same conceptual aim as in the Dohány synagogue. Another significant element in the Kazinci synagogue is the menorah, which appears repeatedly throughout the interior, in the stained glass windows above the ark, in large carved wooden elements of the mechitza, as seen here, in cast iron around the bima, painted on the eastern wall, and in small stylized versions distributed all across the building. The menorah in synagogues traditionally functions as a mnemonic reference to the Beit HaMikdash and its destruction. Significantly, however, the menorot in the Kazinci synagogue are not 7-branched, but are consistently rendered with 5 branches. This choice aligns with the Babylonian Talmud's Masachet Rosh Hashanah, which permits menorot with 5, 6, 8, or other number of branches, and explicitly discourages the exact replication of the 7-branch temple menorah. The systematic and emphatic use of this 5-branch menorah throughout the Kozinci Street synagogue, however, goes beyond mere compliance and points to a deliberate strategy of symbolic regulation. Situated in close proximity to the Dohain synagogue, and the response to this consistent avoidance of the 7-branch menorah forms an articulate, clear counterposition. Whereas Dohain advances a symbolic language that gestures toward the temple analogy, Kozinci insists on defining itself explicitly outside any such claim. Read together, the 3 synagogues of the Pest Triangle articulate distinct responses to the same historical pressures. These developments unfolded within a relatively short time span, during which synagogue architecture in Budapest became a site of unusually concentrated ideological experimentation. Taken together, these architectural choices show how synagogue design functioned not merely as an aesthetic decision, but as a medium through which denominational identity and communal boundaries were articulated within a shared urban and political framework.